Our next guest comes from a long line of military veterans. Third generation military veteran, Vanderbilt Army, ROTC. And he was a highly decorated, sought after, and incredibly successful infantry recon platoon leader in Iraq. He was, given access to NSA, SIGINT assets, and he developed day and night kill and capture raiding capability and techniques that were so beyond what anybody had seen before that our allies would insert their special operators to try to learn how he was doing this. He became a division asset and then a special mission units operator running JSOC missions for Task Force Night. Then he went to Harvard Business School and decided at the end of that he would turn down offers from McKinsey and other illustrious names to basically surf couches and eat tuna and ramen and try to build his first startup. And that's about the time I met Blake Hall. So where are you, Blake? Right there. Please come up. He embodies, like I said, the selfless traits, and he now runs a company called ID.me that I would imagine everybody's hand would go up who's used it before. Craig and I were some of the first angels to invest in Blake, and we've invested in every round where there was an availability to do that. So as angels, as syndicates, and in funds 2 and 3. Fund 1 missed a window of an ability to invest, but I could say pretty aggressively, we are long ID.me. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we're honored to have you listen to Blake Hall talk a little bit about ID.me and what he's doing.
Good morning. I want to talk a little bit about service today, and before I get into my story and my family and everything that has shaped me, what we're doing at ID.me, I also want to say thank you to Kelly and Craig. I truly would not be an entrepreneur without Kelly Purdue. He changed my life in terms of giving me a skill set and helping me not mess things up at a time when I would have messed up a lot of things, and also one thing when you leave the military that you lose is a sense of team and camaraderie. It's different when you're an entrepreneur. It's the loneliest thing I've ever done at the start, and Kelly was in my foxhole with me and kept me going through some of the darkest days. So I really love you, Kelly, love you, Craig, and thank you for everything that you've done for me and now for all the people that we're able to serve through ID.me as a company. So I was talking to Sergeant Major Grinston when I was coming in here this morning. My grandfather was a Sergeant Major as well. He landed at Anzio at 17 years old as a Browning automatic rifleman, Bloody Anzio, where a Ranger battalion was literally destroyed. Fought his way up through the Alps, won a Bronze Star with Valor for crawling out in front of 3 German machine gun nests to splice a line to save his battalion from being overrun by a Nazi assault, standing sentry on the Rhine when Germany surrendered, and then fought in Korea, 2 tours in Vietnam. So when you think about service and what we all enjoy as the American way of life, I've always felt a deep obligation because of my family who served to live up to his name and to the precedent that he set. When I was in Iraq, carrying 32 soldiers' lives with me every day in our attachments, and feeling the responsibility for that. It really is an amazing thing to be a soldier because in the American military, our purpose is to protect the weak and the unarmed, the folks who are truly oppressed because they don't have basic human rights, something that's being lost in today's discourse. But that's what gave me purpose, is that we get to protect our freedoms and our way of life, how human beings are meant to live, and we're also there to fight back against the bullies who would take that away. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at ID.me. I'm going to try to see if I can. So one thing, if you've heard Kelly and I talk, what I needed when I left the military was a sense of purpose. I felt like I'd lost that. I wanted to feel the same sense of giving back and to something bigger than myself, something that mattered, that would make a positive impact on people's lives. Of course, it's a paradox. Of course we care about money, but it's not the main thing. And that totally resonated with me, that the folks who are really solving hard problems, they're not in it for profit motive or just for their self-interest. They're in it because they're after solving a problem that is meaningful. And that's where, despite all of our personality traits and everything else, like making human beings a multiplanetary species and the resilience of mankind, that's pretty inspiring. So for me, when we won grant funding from the Department of Commerce, this is in 2013, identity theft was already looked at as a major problem in American society. It was increasing at a velocity that the Department of Commerce felt was unsustainable. It reduces trust in the economy. And if you look at how the rate of identity theft and fraud has increased since then, it's up by over 200% since 2010. Now, why does that matter? Well, victims of identity theft are really traumatized. 16% of them contemplate suicide, according to the Identity Theft Resource Center. That's up from 8% last year. Really concerns me. The evil cousins to ChatGPT and what OpenAI are doing, these LLMs that are trained to scam people, they're getting really, really good. And when folks, whether it's romance or real estate or whatever, realize that their life savings are gone and they feel guilt and shame, it devastates someone's life. You can read, I'm not going to drain the slide, but in this case, it caused the death of this woman's marriage. And so when we think about who we want to serve and who we want to protect, we've got to stop that because it's really devastating folks' lives. I want to talk a little bit about, in the infantry, we have this ethos of no man left behind. And so brought that into ID.me with a no identity left behind ethos. And want to talk about barriers to access in terms of digital services and government. There are some things that we know, like digital literacy, access to internet, and everything else, but there's actually some other major barriers, including fraud that reduces access, and a few other things that we're fighting. So I'm a nerd. I love math. In fact, when we had a DevGru guy come by our unit when I was over in Iraq, and he's like, "What are you guys doing?" It's like, I can do math really fast in my head. So that helps in terms of vectoring into where the target's at based on the SIGINT intelligence that we're getting off a few different assets. If you're familiar with statistics, R squared is the degree to which one variable explains or is correlated with an outcome. And so there's a few things, and this is intuitive, that as the incentive to do something goes up, more people are going to not abandon that flow. And it's kind of the difference between getting your unemployment benefits versus accessing your DD-214 because you're curious. The more that the value goes up, the more that the incentive goes up. The problem with that is that the more that the value goes up, the more that that becomes a target for fraud. Because ultimately, security is a profit equation. What's my reward, and then how much am I going to invest to go get it? The other major barrier outside of fraud, where somebody is deprived of their ticket in line, so to speak, are shortcomings of existing data sources. When I left the military, you had to go into the VA in person to prove your identity, which is brutal, because if you didn't live close to a VA facility, you were just out of luck. We brought that online in 2016 for the first time, but then I realized that the Department of Commerce standards were written in such a way that you effectively had to have credit history in order to prove who you were when you were accessing the VA online. 45 million Americans don't have credit history. In fact, there's almost 9 million Americans who live overseas. If they were a state, they'd be the 12th largest state in the country, completely excluded from services. As you think about income, what we'd effectively done is we tied access to affluence, and then women also had lower rates of access because women are more likely to change their names in our society. I didn't feel like that was fair, and I'll talk a little bit about things that we did to fight this gap. One of the things that we also found is that for rural populations, like for Puerto Ricans, they live in family homes, so if you looked at their driver's license, the address that's on their driver's license would be where they live, but when they transact with the government, they use P.O. boxes. And so what the credit bureaus have, or they have the P.O. box address, and when they try to verify who they are online, they're not able to get access because the data doesn't match. And so you have these populations that just because of the way that the society is set up and the culture, they're deprived of access. And for me, it's really important that we solve these barriers. There's 67 million Americans that speak a language other than English at home. You got tribal users, you got Haitian Creole in Florida and everything else. And so we really wanted to fight some of these gaps as well to make sure that folks could have a good experience. So some of the things that we did on a product level is we extended our capabilities to be able to verify folks who traditionally had been excluded from digital services. One of the first gentlemen who went through on video chat, this is 2018, he's an 81-year-old veteran, lives in Tokyo, his wife had Alzheimer's. He hadn't been able to access his VA benefits in years. And at the end of that session, he started to cry. And it was just one of those moments where it's like, this is why we do what we do in terms of serving this gentleman, pushing the edge for access to communities that have been underserved, while also holding the line against fraud and identity theft to fight that scourge that we talked about up front. So we've created 3 different pathways. We have hundreds to then thousands of video chat agents, and then we have our self-serve pathway, and I'll talk a little bit about what that's meant for impact. From an investor standpoint, this talk will be a little bit fruit at the bottom. I'll get into the financial profile of the company and liquidity and valuation, all that stuff, towards the end. But the reason that some of those numbers are going to be so phenomenal is because of this, that what we did is we said the login system and the identity authentication stack should not be designed around any one institution. It should be designed around you as the individual. It's how our physical wallets work. You can literally just look at how people use their wallets and say, well, that's how my digital wallet should work too. And because we've stuck to that simple principle, which is that you should control your own data, and we're going to include more people while keeping bad guys out, we are now the single sign-on for 16 federal agencies, 40 state agencies, and we have 130 million Americans that are signed up. So we've enrolled over half of the American adult population. This is what the login process, if you've used us, if you're already verified, you just have to log in and provide consent. And as you know, the business model is Visa. Once we've verified somebody one time, we remonetize that credential nth number of times at 95% gross margin. And so the trajectory of the business is really good, but it's good because we're increasing access and we're taking friction out of people's lives. I want to share a little bit about this because we're going to start publishing quarterly briefings on the types of fraud that we're seeing tied to generative AI. I think it's a huge problem. The problem really started during the pandemic. So this is Arizona. When we went into Arizona in October of 2020, they had 570,400 new weekly unemployment claims. Arizona's only got 7 million people, including kids. The week after us, 6,700. And these states said, we knew it was fraud, not because we had any advanced tooling or anything, but because the bots would fill out the form end to end in less than 60 seconds. Got a shout out from the Assistant Secretary of Treasury there, which is pretty cool. But what's really troubling is, I was listening to Phil Venables at Google Cloud talk. These fraud rings, they reinvest 30% of their gains back into their R&D. That's an unbelievable, Silicon Valley, if you're above 20%, that's top shelf in terms of the R&D organization. 30%. And so a lot of the gains that happened during the unemployment crisis and with PPP at SBA has been refunneled into these generative AI tools that are now being used for the next wave of attacks in terms of increasing the threat against our institutions. As we shut down the fraud here, Arizona came back and they said, hey, of all the claims that we processed from March through October, it's 265,000, we're really worried that there's a lot of fraud in what we had processed. Would you rescreen everybody who'd applied? Any guesses as to how many of the 265,000 claimants tried to verify their identity when Arizona asked them to?
27,000.
Very specific, I like it. 92,000. So 66% didn't even try to verify their identity. We were hit with 4 denial of service attacks out of West Africa, 2.2 billion malicious DNS queries in a single day, and hundreds of millions of IP hits from Yandex addresses, which is Russia's internet service provider. It was unbelievable. They were paying $600 plus per week on those claims. So just do the math on that, take it out across 6-7 months. And that's why you can start to see how we lost so much money, that you could have a name, date of birth, social security number, and defraud the government. What spread our adoption across the country was that when we stopped it in Arizona and California, it didn't stop, it just moved. It just moved from state to state. So you can see the larger states had dramatic decreases where over 90% of the claimants were fraud. In Florida, after we shut it down, in Arizona and California, it moved to Florida in January, then it moved to New York, where we went in February and March. Governor Cuomo did a press release on that. Smaller states weren't attacked as much because it's harder to hide a scalable attack in a smaller state. If you're doing in California what you do in North Dakota, or in North Dakota what you do in California, it's going to pop out really quickly. So for that reason, there are now two testimonials to us. I think the one on the right, taking it back to fraud and identity theft, Nick Johnson, who's the deputy attorney general, I believe, or district attorney rather, for Sacramento, said that the scores and scores of identity theft victims that were happening before ID.me, it stopped as soon as we went live. And I'm really proud of our team. That's what motivates us, because fraud is friction. There is nothing that devastates someone's life or takes friction away like fraud. In fact, I think on tax refund fraud, it takes over a year for the IRS to investigate those claims. This is how we add value to businesses. The government can deliver services in 3 ways: online, call center, in person. So when you over double the traffic and service delivery through the digital channel, you take that call volume away and you lower their administrative burden. They were so understaffed, they couldn't even pick up the phone. Now they can, and we don't have all the studies. We'll need to get Forrester and Gartner in there, but if you look at all the stuff coming out of the IRS around the improving customer service, a lot of it is because we've moved the service delivery to the digital channel. And when you do that, it costs the IRS $54 to deliver services through the call center, $89 in person. So what Nand was talking about is like taking all the expensive humans, out of the workflow through technology. That's literally what we're doing, classic SaaS, but we're doing it at a moment of great stress and need in terms of someone getting access to their unemployment, their child advance tax credit, maybe after a hurricane emergency relief and things like that. So it's really, really important. These are some of the anecdotes of veterans that we've served across the country. We've now verified over 9.5 million of the 60 million Americans that we've verified to the Department of Commerce standards through that video chat channel that we pioneered. It's really, really incredible. These are folks who are unbanked, underbanked, live abroad. We have people come up to us at Social Security and IRS conventions, and they say, ID.me is the reason that for the first time in 2 decades I'm able to access my government because I've lived overseas. And so it's just really, really incredible. These are some of the evil LLMs. Literally, you can just subscribe to them on the dark web. And these are what scammers are using to defraud victims. The FBI last year with LinkedIn reported there were 32 million fake accounts on LinkedIn alone. I had no idea that the scams were this big. And in fact, last summer, there was an exponential increase as these evil LLMs were helping these attackers scale their attacks through productivity. We were fighting tens of thousands of scam attacks per day. And even right now, 85% of the attacks that we face are through social engineering scams where people have been fooled and tricked. Only 15% are technical attacks. As you can see, the left is kind of your traditional Nigerian prince email, and the grammar's bad and everything else. The stuff on the right is what it is today, and it is really, really good. In fact, most of the victims of scams that we're seeing, and this is also tracks in the FTC data, they're young people. They're in job scams, or they're in real estate or crypto or investment scams, and it's really good. We have to figure out a way to stop this as a country. A 267% increase in fraud and identity theft can't stand, especially given the amount of money that's at stake. So back in 2020, the FBI indicted 4 Chinese nationals that were tied to really its economic warfare arm. Not clear if it's Chinese state-sponsored or they just turn a blind eye and let them do what they're going to do for personal profit. And I was just with Kevin Mandiant as well, because ID.me stopped this group at the front door. They were a major perpetrator of those crazy numbers that you saw early on. And then what they did is they breached the agencies on the back door, repurposed the domain, had a server that looked like ID.me sending data into these agencies. And it's pretty nuts. Like, we're still figuring out the full amount of loss that these Chinese nationals have taken from state government agencies. But right now, we're monitoring attacks on 2 East Coast states that we're fighting against right now that are threats emanating out of China. The Nigerians tend to attack the West Coast. Why? I don't know. The selfie step is incredibly important, and I'm actually going to focus on this next one because it shows some of the generative AI attacks that we're facing right now. A few weeks ago, we actually caught a selfie of a guy. He was part of an Asian threat group. He had on a People's Liberation Army undershirt, had taken his combat blouse off, but still had his undershirt on. What these attackers are doing to try to get around the biometric step is we have a step called presentation attack detection. So when you take the selfie, it's not just that your face, matches the photo on the ID, it's genuine assurance that that is actually a face. It's the one thing that these organized crime groups have not been able to defeat. What they'll do is they'll go get a facial recognition API, and they will use synthetic faces and generative AI to try to reverse engineer the geometry of a face. And so they'll run in a sandbox against one of the facial rec algorithms until they find a face that you could look at that is clearly aesthetically different, but geometrically the math matches, okay? This is the cat and mouse that we are literally playing against right now. As investors, it's a reason to be excited in a way in that this wave of generative AI attacks, institutions can't stand on their own against it. We are, in much the same way that organizations had to move on-prem to the cloud, we essentially are that for identity theft. Our machine learning models are still catching these attacks based on other signals that we're seeing, but it is a huge, huge problem. And there's like political things where agencies don't want to release the full extent of how much they've been defrauded because it just doesn't look good. You kind of saw that with the 60 Minutes and some of the stuff going on with like the Russians and Havana syndrome and everything else. We have a real problem with transparency and talking about what is actually happening. And I have a problem with that because you can't solve problems if you can't acknowledge what's real and talk about why it's happening. But this stuff is pretty nuts. So I want to leave you with a little bit of sunshine in your tunnels. So as you look at the world before ID.me, from left to right, these are income levels, high to low. What we found is that the major barrier to access was not biometrics or facial rec or anything else, it was credit bureaus. We had tied access to affluence in this country, and so ID.me really has set out to right that wrong. That blue line that is increasing the pass rates on the right side, that's video chat. So pass rates for the lowest incomes, if you just have credit bureaus, were 30%. The biometric rate is 98.5 to 99.3 across racial groups and income. It's remarkably high. What closes the barrier is that video chat channel that we pioneered for that gentleman who lives overseas. So we haven't just increased access for the lowest income groups, the most vulnerable folks, we've tripled them. We've closed 75% of the digital divide, and in fact, that data was also reflected in what we did for Puerto Ricans at the IRS. Kelly and I will do our fireside, we'll talk about culture and leadership and everything else, but this is what we are doing right now in ID.me, and I wanted you to have an inside look at the product because we are literally helping people and we're securing the country and taxpayer funds at the same time. I'm very proud of what we're doing. We're going to be a great investment as well, but the reason we're going to be a great investment is because we're increasing access and we're reducing fraud and identity theft relative to the world as we found it. So I'm happy to answer any questions or whatever.
Time for a couple questions,
yeah.
So raise your hand and hit them up.
Like, were you in the selfies before or after you got cracked? I didn't raise my hand.
I think if you had a graph, it would be more than the FTC chart in ID theft, let's say that. What's up, Artie?
Hey, first off, long-time listener, first-time caller, love what you're doing with the show. What do you see as sort of the next tipping point for ID.me? With all the wins, you talk about here, and what do you see as the things that we may hear publicly in the near future?
Yeah, it's really incredible. Chris Mills, our Chief Revenue Officer, who is under Slootman at ServiceNow, has come in, Air Force guy, and just been unbelievable in terms of getting sellers and a pro team. We just have differentiated capabilities now. The majority way that we verify 60% of the identity verifications that we do right now are folks we've already verified somewhere else. So it is the second coming of Visa. And that's why the margins are so high, that when we remonetize a credential, users get access at 99.6%, less than 30 seconds, de minimis fraud, everyone's better off, that's the whole point of Visa, 95% gross margins. Next year it'll be 80%, right? So that driver is big time. That scale is also pushing us into private sector use cases a lot faster. But there's two fundamental drivers. One is generative AI. What we are doing around social engineering scams and LLMs, nobody really is doing, because these people are who they're claiming to be, they're just being scammed. And so we've had folks come through our help desk, they're like, unsuspend my account. And we could look at it and go, oh man, you're a victim of a severe West African social engineering attack. And literally even, I think he got an agent to unsuspend the account, the machine learning model suspended it immediately as soon as they saw the device come in from West Africa. So what we are doing there, as many investors are saying, who's going to be the network and the solution that protects critical American infrastructure? And now we authenticate for like FBI InfraGard and grants.gov and 800, it's going to be ID.me. Because it's what General McChrystal taught us overseas, that it takes a network of good guys to fight a network of bad guys. It takes a network to defeat a network. One thing to correct real quick, I had special missions units operators embedded in my platoon, but was not one myself, so I just want to make sure on that. But that's really amazing. And then the third thing is business users. So half of our federal apps right now are for business users. And this is an emergent use case that we could not have predicted, but it's the white space between Okta and Ping and ForgeRock. Those three things are really exciting. And I think to the extent that you have a fraud event overwhelming, like this guy in Hong Kong wired $25 million to a malicious account after being on what he thought was a Zoom call with his executive team with both biometric cloning and voice. As that surges, ID.me is going to surf across all those organizations in the same way that we did during the pandemic. Okay.